So this is kind of where I grew up. I grew up in this little town called Farmington. I'd guess Farmington it's bigger than Stantonville. It had a couple gas stations, a couple mini marts, doctor's office, that kind of thing, Subway. Up the road about 5 minutes was Mannington. You know, if you needed to go to a grocery store, McDonald's, they had a little bit of that. Probably about the size of Adamsville would be a good comparison. But if you wanted to go to the movies or Walmart, you went to Fairmont. And Fairmont kind of covers this whole area here. I'd say comparable to Corinth, Mississippi. Same here. If you want to go to the movies or go to Walmart, I guess Selmer has a Walmart, a good Walmart, a big Walmart. You go to Corinth. And Fairmont was a lot like that. And so growing up, if we wanted to go to the movies, a chain restaurant, a bigger, nicer restaurant, we'd go to Fairmont. So I was 16 years old, had my driver's license for a couple of months, and I hadn't yet driven to Fairmont. I'd driven around here, and I still look at these curvy roads, and you don't even see the back roads. These are the main roads, right? And you see some of the turns in these. I learned to drive on these. I look back now thinking, how are we still alive learning to drive on roads like these? So, again, I'd never driven all the way to Fairmont because there were some pretty crooked roads to get here. I'd had my driver's license. We had some friends over. It was another preacher's family. They had a couple of kids, a couple years older than me. And that night after dinner, they were going to the movies in Fairmont. So it didn't make sense for me to ride with them because they'd have to backtrack to bring me all the way back. And so I said, Mom, Dad, will you please let me drive to Fairmont to the movies? It's time. The time has come. And they said, okay, that's fine. You can do it this time. So this was kind of the first time they handed me the keys to drive to Fairmont to the movies. First time. And it was also my first car crash. Yeah. I was probably driving a little faster because it had a couple older kids behind me, so I was showing how fast I could drive. It had rained a little bit, and curvy roads and a little bit of rain, and a 16-year-old driving too fast are not a good combination. And I remember coming over this hill. Of course, everything's a hill and everything's a turn. Coming over this hill and going around a turn, and I couldn't make the turn because it was going too fast, and I crashed into the guardrail. I'm thankful that the guardrail was there because over the hill from that guardrail was a stream, and another hill would have been bad. But I didn't damage the car too badly, just put a pretty good dent in it, and I'd almost made it. In fact, I'll go back a slide. If I needed to get right here, I was right there. Man, I was so close. So we drove on to the movies, and I remember calling Mom and Dad from a payphone and saying, hey, this happened. Can I please stay at the movies? And they're like, no, get your tail home, right? They wouldn't let me stay at the movies. I'll never forget the first time they handed me the keys to drive to the movies, and I failed. If you're a guest with us, we're in the Gospel of Luke, and if you want to go ahead and start opening to chapter 9, that's where we are this morning. Up till now, Jesus has done all of the ministry and teaching. He's been doing the miracles. He's been the guy modeling ministry for his disciples. And in Luke chapter 9, he hands the keys over to the 12 disciples. And I sometimes wonder what it must have been like for them to have the keys handed to them. And if they were nervous, if they may have thought, I don't know if we can do this, or if they were like a teenager who'd been given the keys and a credit card for the weekend, if they were looking at one another thinking, man, we're going to get to do miracles. This is going to be awesome. I wonder. But I think they probably, except for Peter, I can imagine Peter ready to go. He had no fear. I bet some of them were kind of nervous about this as they're handed the keys to begin this ministry. And the reason that I think this is important, and the reason I think I relate to this passage, because I think sometimes we're like the disciples. It'd be easy to read this passage and think, okay, this is where Jesus hands the keys to the disciples. Look what they did. But I think this is a reminder that Jesus also hands us the keys. And he says to us, listen, it's your mission now. You've got to carry this out. And like the disciples may have been, we get kind of nervous about that. And we think, okay, great, Jesus, thanks for this opportunity, but I'm not sure I want it because I don't want to crash. I don't want to crash the church or crash somebody's soul. I just don't feel like I'm prepared. I don't know enough. I don't know how. Thanks for the keys, Lord, but I'm just not sure if this is for me. And I think this text gives us some insight into what it must have been like for the disciples and what it's going to look like for us to take the keys from the Lord who gives us the Great Commission or invites us to participate in his mission today. So Luke chapter 9, watch how this begins. And we just read this, and we'll read this first part again. Luke 9, verse 1, and he called the 12. All right, so when we get to chapter 10, as we're walking through Luke, he's going to call the 72. So he's going to send out a bigger group. This is just the 12, and he's sending them out on a test drive, if you will. He called the 12 together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. That's a lot of power, right? And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal. So basically, Jesus brings the 12 and he says, all right, it's your turn. I'm handing you the keys. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to proclaim the message, proclaim the kingdom, and to serve. And they would serve by healing people and casting out demons. So it seems pretty straightforward. Proclaim the kingdom and serve, have compassion on people in a way that leads you to serve them by healing them. And he said to them, take nothing for your journey, no staff, nor bag, nor bread, nor money. And do not have 2 tunics. So don't take anything with you. No credit card, no extra clothes. You're just supposed to go. And you can imagine, again, the tension that the disciples must have felt. They've just been handed the keys. They think, wow, we've been given authority to go do this. And then Jesus says, by the way, don't take anything with you. And so just as soon as we begin to read this and think, okay, he calls us also to go and to serve and to proclaim. And then we read this whole thing about not having anything. All of a sudden, it makes us real nervous. And he continues, verse 4, and whatever house you enter, stay there. And from there depart. There were Jewish teachers during the time of Jesus that traveled around from village to village teaching in the synagogues. And some of them were known for taking advantage of people or known for staying in somebody's home until a better option opened up. And you can get that, don't you? If you were visiting a town as one of these traveling teachers and you were staying with somebody who didn't have very much, but then you find out there's somebody on the other side of town who has a swimming pool and a really nice home theater, you're like, I think I'm going to go across town. Thanks for the hospitality. I think I'm going to go over here. And Jesus is saying, no, once you land in a place, you are to stay there. So we might add to what Jesus says here. Jesus says to his disciples, listen, I want you to proclaim the message. I want you to serve others. And along the way, I want you to trust. And so if you're curious as to how you're supposed to pull this off, the answer is simple. You trust God to provide what you need as you go. And he continues, verse 5. And wherever they do not receive you, so if you go into a town and they kind of run you out of town, when you leave that town, shake off the dust from your feet as a testimony against them. That sounds a little bit spiteful, but in Jewish culture, because they were so serious about their Jewish ethnicity, when they would go to a pagan town, when they left that town, they would literally wipe the dust or the uncleanness of that pagan town off their feet. It was a sign of rejection and almost comes across a little bit arrogant, but Jesus says, listen, if they reject you, they're rejecting God, and so in a sense, you're going to wipe the dust off your feet and say, we're moving on. I'm not going to beat a dead horse. We're going to go to the next place. And so what'd they do? Verse 6, and they departed and went through the villages, preaching the gospel and healing everywhere. So Jesus gives the disciples the keys and say, all right, it's time to give this a test drive. You're going to proclaim my message. You're going to have compassion. So you're going to serve people by casting out demons, and you're going to trust me to provide for you. And they did exactly that. Now, it's a good place to stop and say, Jesus gives us the keys too. He calls us to do the same thing. He calls us to make disciples of all the nations in his Great Commission, Matthew 28, verse 19. And so we go and we proclaim this message. He calls us to serve. Now, we may not serve in the same way that the disciples served by healing and casting out demons, but he also calls us to have compassion on people and serve those who are in need. And all along the way, he calls us to trust. Now, here's the problem. For most of us, we have a tendency to focus on one of these first two, one or the other, don't we? There's some people, it's kind of natural for them just to talk about their faith and talk about Jesus all the time. And when service comes up, they say, listen, you know what's most important? Eternity's most important. So we're going to keep on talking. I'm not worried about that service stuff. And then the tendency probably for more of us is to say, you know what? I'm going to serve, but I'm kind of nervous about bringing up my faith, about talking about Jesus. And this passage is a reminder that Jesus calls us to both. He calls us to proclaim his message and to serve others. And along the way, as we do that, to trust him to provide what we need. So again, as we're just kind of thinking about this and getting started, let me ask you this question. This week, how are you going to proclaim Jesus? Now, I'm not talking about public proclamation. For most of you, it's going to be a one-on-one setting. How are you going to do that? How's Jesus going to come up in day-to-day conversations? in ways that aren't awkward, not making people, though you may sometimes, you talk about Jesus, but how's it going to come up in day-to-day life? And then this week, how are you going to love your neighbor as yourself this week? Have you ever thought about what it looks like to love your neighbor as yourself? It means to provide, if I'm going to love my neighbor as myself, I'm going to see that they have the things that I think I need. If I'm going to take care of myself, there are certain things that I'm going to say, okay, here's some things that I need. And if I love my neighbor as myself, I'm going to look at their life and say, do they have the things that they need? You say, you know what, but sometimes I can go without. Well, think about it this way. What are the things that you would make sure your kids or your grandkids or your aging parents, so whatever stage of life you're in, think kids, grandkids, aging parents, what are the things that you would make sure that they have? I mean, I've put a little list on the screen. I think this fits pretty well. Food, clothing, shelter, education. Is that something that you would say you're going to make sure your kids have? Your grandkids, health care? I think so. Transportation, companionship. Right? I think the people that we love, we're going to make sure, at bare minimum, we're going to make sure they have these things. So if I'm going to love my neighbor as myself, or love my neighbor in the same way that I love the people that I love in my life, I'm going to see that I'm going to meet these needs. And so maybe a good question as you move forward this week and you try to serve others is to ask, okay, is there anybody in my life who needs any of this? And how can I serve them? And so we follow this model that Jesus sends his disciples out on, and we simply proclaim Jesus, we serve, and we trust God to provide along the way. I think one of the reasons that we love as a church supporting the Nicaragua Christian School is because they do this. I love how they proclaim Jesus. The kids who go to that school learn about Jesus and come to know God through that school, but they also provide what they need. So if you're kind of struggling, I've just asked you the question, hey, how can you meet needs of people this week and love your neighbor as yourself? If you're kind of looking for a way to do that and kind of ramp that up, let me give you one real specific way. All right, and this is for our members and really anybody who knows about the Nicaragua Christian School. You can support a student, like pay for a student's education and food, for the basic things that they need for 1 month for $40. Now, some of you say, well, I can't afford that. I'll tell you what we do. I'm combined with 2 other people, and we all pitch in together. You say, well, $40 doesn't divide by 3 very well. You're right. We do 15, 15, and 10. And together we support one student at the Nicaragua Christian School. So here's a simple, I'm not saying you have to do this at all. I'm just trying to give you an idea. If you're struggling to think of a way to serve someone and love your neighbor as yourself, it's a really simple way to do it. Maybe get with some other people and do this. So here's what I'm offering. If you want to do this, hand me a piece of paper with your email on the way out this morning, and I will send your email to the person who organizes this at the Campbell Street Church in Jackson, and we'll get you set up. All right? So this is a real simple way, a concrete way that you can actually meet the needs of other people. Now, there's kind of a side note in this text. We'll come back to the text. So the disciples have gone out preaching and serving and doing miracles, and now it's not just Jesus. It's Jesus and his 12 guys. And the leaders take notice. Watch this, verse 7. Now Herod the Tetrarch, so this is the guy over Galilee where Jesus is doing all this ministry. Herod the Tetrarch heard about all that was happening. There's a bunch that's happening, right? The 12 disciples are doing all this. Jesus is doing it. And he was perplexed because it was said by some that John had been raised from the dead. So some people are saying, hey, John, the guy that you killed, Herod, this is not a good guy. Herod was responsible for the death of John the Baptist. And some people are saying, hey, maybe this is John the Baptist raised from the dead. Can you imagine that kind of creeped Herod out a little bit? He's like looking over his shoulder. Maybe he's scared to fall asleep if John the Baptist, who he killed, has now been raised from the dead. And others, verse 8, by some that Elijah had appeared. Now that's kind of weird, but there was this tradition among the Jews that Elijah, who did not die, he was taken up in the chariots of fire. There was this tradition that said before the end of time, Elijah would come back. It's kind of a weird thing that was happening. So some said, hey, Elijah's back. That must mean the end is near. And by others, that one of the prophets of old had risen. Herod said, John I beheaded, but who is this about whom I hear such things? And he sought to see him. Now, as you come to the end of the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23, Herod will see Jesus. And he doesn't really want to learn from him. He just wants to see a miracle, and he mocks him, he mistreats him. He'll get his chance to see Jesus. But it's a side note. They're making enough noise in Galilee that the rulers are taking note and wanting to see what's going on and want to learn about Jesus. And so they come to the end of this. Look at verse 10. And on their return, I'd love to know how long they were gone. I just would. How long were these guys gone? But on their return, is it a week? Is it 3 or 4 days? They go around Galilee doing all the miracles and preaching. And on their return, the apostles told him all they had done. And don't you think they had some stories? I mean, if this was their first time to do some miracles, changing people's lives, man, I bet they had some great stories that they couldn't wait to tell Jesus. And he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. So they were going to have a time of debriefing. He was trying to get away from the crowds, but the crowds follow. Verse 11, when the crowds learned it, they followed him. Now, when you're trying to get away and people follow you, what's your reaction? My reaction is to run, like to go away faster. I'm let you in on a secret, students. On Friday afternoon, when I'm trying to get out of the office and get out of Freed-Hardeman, I go a back way out of the building I work in because I don't want to run into anybody because I just want to go, I'm ready for the weekend. And Jesus is kind of trying to get away, right? So don't look for me on Friday afternoons when that back way out of GC. Jesus and his guys are trying to get away so they can kind of debrief what's happened. And the crowds followed him. And watch what Jesus does. They followed him, verse 11, and he welcomed them and spoke to them of the kingdom of God and cured those who had need of healing. You know what Jesus does? He does exactly what he had called his disciples to do. The text says he preaches and he heals. He proclaims and he serves. Now, you know what the rest of this passage is we're about to read. It's one that you're really, really familiar with. It's the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. And there's this temptation to disconnect the feeding of the 5,000 from what we've just read. But I think that's a mistake. I think what Jesus does when he feeds the 5,000 is give just a really focused example of what he's called the disciples to do by proclaiming and serving. Except as you read the text, Jesus proclaims and serves, and it's the disciples who don't trust. So don't disconnect this from the rest of the story. Watch what Jesus does. Now the day began to wear away. All these people are following him. And the 12 came and said to him, send the crowd away to go into the surrounding villages and countryside to find lodging and get provisions, for we are here in a desolate place. Isn't it ironic? What have the disciples just come back from doing? From trusting God to provide for them, and now they don't trust God to provide for all of these people, so that's ironic. Secondly, who have they been depending on? The hospitality of other people. As they went from town to town to town, Jesus says, listen, just don't take anything with you. You got to count on other people. And now here's their chance to show hospitality, and what do? Jesus, let's send them away. Let's get these people out of here. And Jesus says, no, you give them something to eat. Second half of verse 13. Well, verse 13, he says, you give them something to eat. They said, we have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish. John's account says it's a little boy's lunch. Unless we are to go and buy food for all these people. For there were about 5,000 men. So are there 15, 20,000 people? We don't know. And he said to his disciples, have them sit down in groups of about 50 each. And they did so. So the disciples don't know how they're going to work this out. There's a lack of trust on the disciples' part. But isn't it cool that as Jesus tells them to take little baby steps, that they take the baby steps? And there are times when maybe we lack faith, but what we can still keep doing is keep taking those little baby steps. Jesus says, okay, have everybody sit down. They don't say, Jesus, this isn't going to make sense. Let's send them away. No. Have them sit down. And they have them sit down. And they did so, verse 15, and had them all sit down. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing over them. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the crowd. And again, could the disciples have said, Jesus, what are we doing? No. Baby steps. They're struggling with their faith, but they take the baby steps. And God uses their baby steps to build their trust. Verse 17, and they all ate and were satisfied. And what was left over was picked up 12 baskets of broken pieces. 12 baskets because there were 12 apostles. They probably each had a basket. Probably not a ton of symbolism or anything there. Isn't it amazing that Jesus performs this miracle in the context of what he's just called the disciples to do? Now, don't miss it. This is an incredible miracle. And in John's account of this, it says the people were amazed by this. But those same people want to make Jesus the king. And all of a sudden, when he starts teaching, that he is the bread of life. They don't want anything else to do with him. So this miracle itself isn't necessarily going to cause people to follow Jesus. So why does he do it? Surely there were some people who followed Jesus because of this. I think he does this to teach his disciples a lesson about trust. Can you imagine what this would have been like to have just gone out and done all of these miracles and preached all of these messages to the villages, and then you come back and all of a sudden you don't have enough faith to believe that Jesus could feed these people, and he does. And so maybe the way we kind of wrap this up and see what Jesus does here is this. I would say, yeah, Jesus called his disciples to proclaim, to serve, and though they had a little bit of trouble with it in this text, in this story, to trust. And if they'll do that, then they can just watch God do his thing. And Jesus, in this miracle, does his thing. And he must have amazed the disciples and taught them a valuable lesson that when you proclaim and when you serve, listen, it's going to be hard. But if you trust me, look what I can do. Look what I can do. And don't we need this lesson today? I do. Because sometimes I think, you know what, I know that God wants me to talk about my faith to people in the community. Listen, I talk about the Bible all day long. It's my job. I talk to you students about it. And I come here on Sundays and talk about it. But sometimes it's hard to do that in the community. It makes me a little nervous. And I think about service and say, okay, but I'm really busy. And we have all of the reasons that we don't want to proclaim, we don't want to talk about our faith, and we don't want to serve. And we say, well, I can't, or I don't know how. And perhaps the very best thing God could say to us is, listen, just take the baby steps, do what I'm calling you to do, and trust me. Just trust. And when you trust, watch what I'll do. Watch how I will work through you if you'll just trust me enough to do what I want you to do. Perhaps this is a simple way to put it. Christian service is a venture of faith from beginning to end. If you're going to live out your life in a way that causes you to serve every single day, there are going to be times when it doesn't make sense to serve, and you're going to think there's no use in this. Why am I doing this? I don't even know how to do this. Listen, you've got to trust. Because from beginning to end, Christian life, Christian service is a venture of faith, which is exactly what we said last week if you were here with us. As we looked at the story in chapter 8, we said that what you see is not what you get when you follow Jesus. And when we serve and when we proclaim, it's the same thing. What we see is not what we get. We're trusting God to provide something even when we can't see it because we walk by faith and not by sight. So, here are a couple of killer phrases that prevent us from doing this well. All right, so if we're going to do this well, we're going to proclaim and serve and trust and then watch God work. Here's what stops us from doing this. You ever said this? Ever heard this before? We've never done that before. I wonder if the disciples said to Jesus, we don't get the whole conversation here. Jesus, there's 5,000 people. You've done some pretty awesome things, but you've never done that before. Or, well, we could never do that. We don't have enough manpower. We don't have enough money. We don't have enough talents to do that. We could never do that. Or have you ever said that? In your daily walk with Christ, as you are presented with opportunities to serve others, you say something like, I've never done that before. Or, I could never do that. As you look at where we've come as a church, some of us have said this along the way. Aren't you glad the majority didn't listen? Aren't you glad we didn't buy into these lame excuses and decided instead to proclaim and to serve and to trust? And we get to see what God has done with that. We get to watch God work. So let me give you just a couple of challenges to walk away from this message with. Number one, I want to challenge you to trust our elders as they lead us in this. As they lead us forward in proclaiming Jesus, in serving our community, in serving the world, and trusting God. And I want to challenge them to keep pushing us to do this. And I want to challenge you to trust them as they lead us forward in this. And watch what God will do. Here's the second thing I want to challenge you to do. This is a simple one. I just want you to ask this week, how can I proclaim Jesus? How can I talk about my faith this week? And second, how can I serve others this week? That's really simple, isn't it? But isn't this what Christianity is all about? How can I serve others? How can I talk about Jesus and then trust God as I do it all? And then here's the third one. In what areas are you saying, I could never do that? Or I have never done that? So in your life right now, what excuses, what are some things that you've said, that looks like a really good opportunity, but I don't think I can do that? What is it for you individually where you're offering some excuses and saying you can't do it and you're not trusting? And then fourth, here's the last one. Dream. Just dream. I love that our college students have big dreams about the future, but did you know that every big thing that occurs, that God uses to accomplish big things, starts with just a thought? Somewhere, somebody along the line said, you know what, it'd be really cool to start a school in Nicaragua. And look what God's doing now. Somebody not far from here said, hey, wouldn't it be cool to start up a widowhood ministry? And look what that seed sparked there and has sparked in other places and has sparked here when somebody said, wonder if we could do one of those. Now every month, more than 40 widows and widowers show up here to spend time together, and we get to proclaim the message and to serve them through that. It's just a thought, just a little dream. So what little dream do you need to dream this week and start putting into action? And when you trust, imagine what God could do. Just a little trust, just a mustard seed of faith. Imagine what God could do. You see, really, this is how we respond to Jesus. We say, listen, God, I don't understand. All I know is that I'm lost, and I need you, and I trust you. I don't understand why you've called us to do things the way you have, but when we submit our lives to him and trust him and submit our lives to baptism, then we watch what God does. He takes our lives, and he transforms our lives, and he forgives us of our sins. And so maybe today you've never put Christ on in baptism. By submitting your trust and your life to him, then today would be a great, great day for that. And we'd love to help you with that. Maybe today you've struggled with this. You've struggled to trust, and you've kind of thought you had it figured out, or you couldn't do anything. And maybe today you need the prayers of this church. We would love to pray for you. Every week when I prepare these messages, I get to the end of my preparation. I say, okay, I want some good story or some really good example of this when I get to the end. And some weeks, I can't think of anything, all right? There's some pressure there to close well. And so what often happens is, in my notes as I'm kind of wrapping it up, I put, need a story, right? And I just type it in there. And then for the rest of the week, I try to think of something. The problem is usually I forget about it till about Saturday night, and then I'm like, oh yeah, I need a good story to wrap this thing up with. Yesterday, I didn't have to think about it anymore, because I experienced something that immediately reminded me of this and vividly illustrated what we're talking about this morning. Yesterday morning, I sat in a funeral at the Savannah Church of Christ for the mom of one of your professors, the husband of some of you work with Eddie Harden, sat in the funeral home, or in the church, Savannah, full auditorium, and listened to people, really listened to her 3 boys and her husband describe her life. And Mrs. Harden lived a life that was constantly on the go. I mean, just go, 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 and it was constantly serving, and it was constantly telling other people about Jesus. In fact, for those of you who know Mr. Harden, they said he just kept everything with a motor running so that she could go, 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 because it was fast-paced, man. I mean, she was just constantly on the go, serving and proclaiming, whether that was having people in her home or at the church building. She was just always on the go. And though they were using different words, it dawned on me as I was sitting there trying to keep my composure, listening to her boys up there talking, that they were just describing a life in which she had proclaimed Jesus, she had served others, she had trusted God. And that auditorium was full of people whose life had been impacted. They had seen God work through her service and a proclamation and a trust. Friday morning, about 9 hours away, Mom and Dad sat in a funeral home in Ohio, full of people, hundreds of people just like over in Savannah, that were there because they had witnessed a life of proclamation and service. In fact, he died in India proclaiming and serving, and he got bit by an insect, and that's what led to it. But what was he doing? He was proclaiming and serving and trusting. And my life was one of those lives that was impacted as God worked through this man's life. There's something about a funeral that makes you think. And so as I sat there, I just couldn't help but think about what I was going to talk about today. Because auditoriums that were full of people who'd seen a life that proclaimed the message, served God, trusted God, and they had seen God work through that person. When it's all said and done for me, and when it's all said and done for you, don't you want people to look at your life and say, yeah, they proclaimed Jesus. They talked about Jesus everywhere they went. They served others, and they trusted God. And wow, look how God worked through them. That's what I want.